All right, so I get to introduce Dan Woodward. Dan has been, she's been associated with the program for as long as really I've been involved. So that's quite some time. He is an undergraduate, Bachelor's of Science graduate from Florida. He got his MBA mid-'80s or so.
Yeah, good memory.
With a concentration or an emphasis in real estate. Worked for a while, then he went up to Boston and did the Master's of Science in Real Estate Development at MIT. He's held a variety of positions. I'm sure he'll tell you about those. He's been with Highwoods Properties for over a decade. Sort of runs their Tampa portfolio. So that's leasing, that's asset management, that's property management, that's refinancing. That's all things to do. Highwoods is a publicly traded real estate investment trust. So I'm going to let him tell you about the rest of it. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, and I do appreciate the opportunity. When Dr. Ling reached out to me and mentioned something about the, Dr. Ling reached out to me, mentioned something about the Ring Distinguished Speaker Series, I'm thinking to myself, well, the only thing distinguished about me is the gray hair. So, but hopefully I'll try to give you all a little information on who we are, who I am, how I got here, a little bit about Highwoods, and then some of the things we're working on. So we'll go fairly quick. And I did mention to David, I do want to make this as interactive as possible. I want your input on a lot of the new trends that we're seeing, because you all are at the forefront of that. We've been doing that. I've been doing this for 30 years, and at least in the office segment, there's been a pretty defined recipe in terms of development, in terms of what makes office space work, what's appropriate and what's attractive to our customers. That dynamic is starting to change, and I want your input on that. I'd like to get your input on that. So please, let's make this as interactive as possible. You know, ask questions whenever you need to. I'll probably get off track then and have to get back on track, but that's okay. So just briefly, a little bit about me. I was raised in a military family, so you know, I spent most of my growing up, maybe 1 or 2 years in a particular location, didn't know anything about business. Basically, I knew, you know, what ran the military, national security, things like that, but knew nothing about business. Came to the University of Florida. That's really I was a Florida resident at the time. That was really the only school that I wanted to look at for a variety of reasons. And like a lot of undergrads, you know, the first couple of years I bounced around from, you know, pick your major, whatever. One of the few things that interested me at the time was psychology, so graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, enjoyed it. About the first week I got out, I realized I couldn't make a living at it. You know, it was interesting, and as I'd find out later, it would come to benefit me later on, but could not make a living at it. So I was very fortunate enough to be accepted to University of Florida's MBA program. So head first into business. What I realized was I liked the finance side of it. I liked the real estate side of it. I liked the underwriting involved, the cash flow analysis. To me, it was all this math we had learned early on in undergraduate, but it was math with a purpose. We could actually do something with the math. We could create an investment, and not only create an investment, but you could create a tangible investment that you could not only see, touch, and feel, but that could also, for better or for worse, change the nature of your community and the nature of your environment. So that's really what attracted me to Dr. Lean's classes, Dr. Archer's classes, and all the real estate, and that's why I concentrated in real estate during my MBA program here. So got out in the mid-'80s. As I said, I knew nothing about business. You know, I was green as green could be. I was fortunate enough to be hired by a Texas developer, the Vantage Companies at the time, that was opening an office in Tampa. Had a great mentor, Pat Kelly ran that office, saw something in me that I apparently didn't see at the time, and hired me to go into marketing and leasing for them. So great opportunity, wonderful company, developing office buildings all throughout the Southwest and the Southeast. And I had the opportunity to kind of get in on the ground floor with the Tampa division. Developed a couple of office buildings there, we did at the time. I was working as a marketing representative working for them, and realized at some point during my tenure there that really what I found more interesting than trying to lease office space to our customers was really the development side of it, choosing a site, underwriting the development, getting it up, getting it leased, and making it marketable for either sale or for a long-term hold. So, long-winded way of saying, after about 10 years with Vantage, we went through a reorganization when the market went south. We had just to let y'all understand it a little bit more, one of the financing mechanisms that Vantage used is they cross-collateralized most of their office buildings with each other. So they would all kind of drag each other along, but unfortunately when things started going south, even if our office buildings in Tampa were performing well, if the ones in Texas weren't, they kind of drug everything down with it. So Vantage reorganized. We went to more of a services company where we were a fee services company. We didn't really own anything anymore. So I had the opportunity to work on some great fee developments for other owners, whether they be institutional owners or private owners. And through that process in the mid-90s or so, I realized that I wanted to further my education, but specifically targeting development. There were some excellent graduate real estate programs throughout the country, but at least at that time, there was really only one that focused specifically on development, and that was the one in Boston at MIT. So went up there, went through that program, enjoyed the program, great classes, great curriculum. Not saying I'd want to spend another winter up in Boston, but really enjoyed the program. Got out of there, just to make it fairly quick, joined the Pizzuti companies in Orlando, developed close to 1 million square feet for them of office product at International Business Center there in Orlando, kind of in Lake Mary. After they sold that, I joined Trammell Crow Company, again with the development and investment side of the house, not the global services side. So what we were responsible for is finding development deals. Trammell Crow was a little different. We would source the capital to do that, find the development deal, put the deal together, lease it up. And then typically our model was to sell that to one of our institutional investors, and then we'd kind of start the process and find another opportunity again. So that was not necessarily merchant build, but a little bit of the recycling of the capital. And that was a great opportunity. And then in '06, I was approached by Highwoods Properties for a position in Tampa as their division vice president. And one of the things that I found so attractive about that is Highwoods is a vertically integrated real estate investment trust. So that means we do our own leasing, we do our own development, we do our own property management. So that allowed me to bring all these skills that I had been able to acquire over the years with different companies and put them kind of all in one box and work in that company with that team to be able to move forward with that team. So it's kind of like, a little bit of leasing here, a little bit of development with this company. And now with Highwoods in Tampa, we pretty much do everything for ourselves with certain exceptions. So I have some very talented and experienced people on my team, and what I do is I guide them in each of their disciplines, and that allows us to perform well as a division. So just a little bit about how I got where I was. Let me go into a little bit about Highwoods. As Dr. Ling mentioned, we're a real estate investment trust, publicly traded, headquartered in Raleigh. We serve out of 9 divisions, primarily in the Southeast and Pittsburgh. We serve over 1,700 customers, businesses. We refer to them as customers. Founded in '78, so we're about a 40-year-old concern. This kind of gives you a good indication of our footprint. As I mentioned, primarily the Southeast markets. We do have an office in Pittsburgh that does very well. But one of the things to notice here, if you can read that, we're very well diversified, not only from a revenue perspective, but from a customer perspective. So if you look at our geography, I don't think there's any particular division that accounts for more than 20% of our annualized revenue. So it's not like, you know, if we've got we don't have all our eggs in one basket. It's not like we have a large concentration in Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or somewhere where if that market went south, we'd be in serious trouble. Same thing with our customers. With the exception of the GSA, the federal government, we don't have a customer that makes up more than 3% of our annualized revenue. So good, strong diversity there. Balance sheet, I think the keys here are we have a great credit facility. And one of the things that allows us to do, it allows us to execute quickly on potential acquisitions, and it gives the seller a certainty of close with Highwoods. So if we're going after a building, there have been a couple of situations where we have maybe not been the highest bidder on a potential acquisition, yet we were chosen as the successful bidder based upon our certainty of close. And that credit facility that we have access to has a lot to do with that. On the flip side of it, on the development side, if we see a development opportunity, whether that be a build-to-suit or whether that be an anchored speculative development, we can execute it on it immediately. We don't have to go shop for a financing source. So that credit facility that largely is supported by our balance sheet and our low debt ratio allows us to be extremely flexible. The other point on here is 96.2% of our net operating income is unencumbered. What that means is 96% of our net operating income comes from our assets that we own that are not in a joint venture and not secured by a lender. In other words, we make all the decisions in that case. So we don't have to go to a lender if we're working on a significant lease deal or a JV partner. Yeah?
So is the majority of is it company level debt or property level?
The majority of it, the credit facility, and if you were to, I don't have anything on our capital stack, but the credit facility is company debt. Okay. So we don't, there's very little, 4% of it is specific to a property. But there is some that's specific to a property, and that's really done by our Treasury Department for flexibility. It's not a necessity. Again, these are some of the folks on our team. The reason I wanted to show this is, one, we have a very experienced team. They make my job extremely straightforward. I wouldn't say easy, but they make it very straightforward. They're very experienced. They know what they're doing. The other point here is the longevity. I mean, we've got people up there on that screen who have been with the company for more than 20 years. It's a good, strong company. They like what they do. They're good at it. They're the best in their industry. And it suits us well. It serves us very well. A little bit about our Highwoods division. As I mentioned, we're one of 9 divisions, kind of roughly the same size in terms of investment, employees, things like that. Entered the Tampa market in '96. On the left side, you'll see 2 of our West Shore assets. Our 2 dominant focus submarkets in Tampa are West Shore and the CBD. So on the left side, you'll see 2 of our West Shore assets. On the right side, you'll see 2 of our CBD assets. Any of you all who are from Tampa are probably aware of the SunTrust building. That one at the bottom right is actually, we call it Bayshore Place, but it's known as the Bank of Tampa building. It's right there on Bayshore Boulevard. Hopefully you can read this. Gives a little bit of our timeline of the company, as I said, over the past 40 years or so. One of the things I did want to note on here is look at 2005. There's a note about the strategic plan. When we went public, obviously a lot of REITs grow when they go public by buying other portfolios, buying other companies, and you don't always get every asset you want. Sometimes you get a lot of assets that you don't necessarily want to buy the assets that you did want. So as you continue to grow as a public company, eventually there'll come a point where you need to start giving a hard eye at your asset base and figuring out what's core and what's non-core. So in '05, our team, our senior management, put together a strategic plan that involved getting our balance sheet in shape, streamlining our operations, and deciding which assets were core and non-core. We had probably at least twice as many assets as we have now, yet they weren't generating the NOI that ours are generating now. And the reason I bring up the '05 plan is we successfully executed that over the next several years, and it was extremely timely. In '05, we didn't see anything coming. In '07 or '08, we didn't have any magic goggles to see over the horizon and see what was going to happen to the market. It was just fortuitous timing, and it was executed very well by our senior management and our folks at the division level. So that whipped our balance sheet into shape. It had us selling non-core assets at a time where they still had value, and it improved our overall viability. And it helped us, basically push through the economic downturn in '07 and '08. So very fortuitous. We had a lot of skilled people working on that, and it was extremely helpful to us. Investment strategy here, and I don't have Tampa up here, but you'll see what we call up here, what we don't necessarily refer to CBDs, we prefer to refer to them as BBDs, or better business districts, or best business districts. For those of you that are familiar with Atlanta, their CBD is their downtown, whereas from an office perspective, Buckhead is probably the dominant office market. So we have a lot of assets in Buckhead. We refer to that as the BBD. So on the right, you'll see some components of our strategy. One, we want them to be wholly owned. We're a fully integrated REIT, and we want to be able to make our own decisions on a quick basis to the benefit of our customers. We don't want to have to get approval from our lenders or JV partners to do that. So it's wholly owned, unencumbered goes along with that. We don't have debt on most of those properties. And the 100% fungible, that's kind of a bizarre term, but really what that means is in any of our portfolios, our customers have the opportunity to, there's a little more to it than this, but given that, say, Tampa, we have 4 million square feet, and at any given time, we're going to have available space in any of our buildings. So it allows, those assets are fungible to our customers. Our customers, if they need to grow, they can move to another building. We can accommodate that with their existing lease. Whereas if they needed to grow and we only had one building, that's too bad. We're not going to let them out of their lease. In this situation, it's fungible, so we can work with our customers to expand into another one of our buildings and work with them on their existing lease in one of our other buildings. Because it's all fungible to us, it's all wholly owned, it's all, as long as they're expanding, it's all additional square footage to our portfolio. So that gives us a little bit of an advantage for customers that want to grow. Yeah.
So it's pretty evident you guys are heavily focused on the southeast. I'm just curious, it looks like that Pittsburgh has the most building as well as square footage. How did you guys strategically wind up in Pittsburgh?
How did we wind up there? Yeah, that's not necessarily a question for me. Our senior management, when they look at new markets, and they're always looking at new markets, they look at them on the same fundamentals that you would evaluate an investment on, but they look at it on a bigger basis, because we're most likely not going to go into a new market and buy one building. That doesn't necessarily give us the weight we need to perform well in that market. In other words, we wouldn't likely go into New York, we wouldn't likely go into San Francisco or Washington, D.C., because we would be a smaller player like most everybody else there. There are dominant players in those markets. So we look for markets that are maybe overlooked a little bit. I think from my perspective at least, Pittsburgh was probably one of those markets that for years had been getting a bad rap, because of the steel industry, things like that. And Pittsburgh, maybe unbeknownst to a lot of the investment community, reinvented itself, a lot heavy into oil, a lot into education, a lot into healthcare. And when we looked at it and looked at the opportunity there, that was a market that was on the upswing instead of in decline. I will tell you there was a lot of eyebrows raised when we bought in that market and entered into that market. There was a lot of feeling, at least from the established investment community, that Pittsburgh, that's the Rust Belt. Why is a Sun Belt Southeastern high growth market REIT looking at Pittsburgh? But Pittsburgh really has done well for us and has been a great market for us. And their growth patterns, their market fundamentals are very good. So, yeah, that's kind of a, largely Southeastern and then Pittsburgh. Yeah.
So strategically, when you enter these markets, these new markets, are you buying like a portfolio of assets concentrated in that market, or
We're
are you just handpicking one asset?
Well, it's hard to handpick because, the assets we're looking for, the Class A office assets, they don't always come to market and they rarely come to market at the same time. So yeah, if we can find a portfolio of Class A assets that a particular investor in that market is ready to sell and we think it's a reasonable price, yeah, we'll look at that, but it's got to be of such a scale where we can be a player in the market. Like I said, we're probably not going to buy a one-off building in a market just to dip our toe in the water. We're going to make sure we can make a difference in that market. So, yeah.
As far as individual buildings, can you talk a little bit about your criteria for size and purchase price?
Sure. Yeah, I'll get into that in a little bit when we talk about SunTrust. But we do have we have what we call an acquisition scorecard. At any given time, there'll be either no office buildings on the market or, all of a sudden everybody will want to put their building on the market. And we could be looking at 2 or 3 or 4 offering memorandums at the same time. So one of the things we use is an acquisition scorecard that allows us to individually from a division level look at a potential acquisition, score it fairly quickly on a bunch of different levels, which I'll go over. And then, you get a rough score at the bottom and it's, is this something we even want to talk about or is it something that we immediately need to run to investment committee with? So I'll talk about some of those if that's okay in a little bit. Some of our recent acquisitions, Monarch Tower in Atlanta, you see the SunTrust building there, a couple of acquisitions in Raleigh, and Monarch, the 2 Monarch Plaza and Monarch Tower were bought the same day that we bought SunTrust. And that was done on purpose. We were getting out of a retail market in Kansas City. We owned Country Club Plaza at the time. We were selling that to really more focus on office and move out of the retail sector. And that allowed us to buy those 2 assets in Atlanta and SunTrust without having to do any type of additional capitalization. Our development pipeline, this is our current pipeline. So about $440 million. One of the things that we like to tout is it's 77% pre-leased. So, I'm not saying 100% spec's a dirty word, but the street and the market and lenders, and you talk about 100% spec office building in it, it makes people a little bit uncomfortable. That doesn't mean we haven't done it in certain markets where the market fundamentals are strong enough. But overall, if you look at our pipeline as a whole, it's 77% pre-leased. Obviously, I don't see anything up there for Tampa. I'll go over some of that in a little bit. There's some challenges in the Florida market with construction costs, trying to get new development started. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This was last year's pipeline, what we delivered in 2017. Riverwood 200, that was an anchored speculative building in Atlanta. And then Bridgestone Tower is 500,000 square foot build-to-suit for Bridgestone USA in Memphis. It was a great asset for us, a great opportunity, and that was delivered last year. So 2018, we've got our current pipeline here, but we're looking to increase that as well and have more development starts for 18. This is just kind of a diagram that shows how we think about things and what goes into making sure that our cash flow and our FFO is where it needs to be. And all of this comes down to pre-lease developments, basic blocking and tackling, low leverage, good balance sheet. And just the bottom one that kind of rides over everything is just a simple strategy. Our general counsel has what he calls a war on complexity. And if something is overly complex, we tend to try to distill it into something that's more basic and helps us perform on a more streamlined basis. So this is kind of what underlies our company philosophy here. I want to talk a little bit about our SunTrust acquisition. At least in Tampa, our last acquisition was over 2 years ago. The investment market's gotten a little frothy. Cap rates have been forced down a little bit. There's additional sources of capital, offshore capital coming into the market. And we've been looking at buildings since then that meet our criteria, and they've been priced at a level that just hasn't made sense for us since SunTrust. So that's why we're going to go over that a little bit. However, because we are fully integrated and we have a great development team both locally and corporately, when things get too expensive on the existing building side, assuming construction costs are reasonable, we can shift into more of a development mode. And that's what helps us grow, either development, acquisition, or imputed rent increases. This is an aerial looking north. Those of you that are from Tampa, you might recognize some of these buildings, and it's a little hard to read, but this is a slide we used when we were looking at this potential acquisition and noting all the other competing office buildings downtown, how leased they were, what they had sold for, some of the cap rates to the extent that we could find them. And a lot of these were pre-2015 sales. There have been a couple since then, not a whole lot, but this gives you kind of an indication of where we were. In particular, I think SunTrust, we'll go over that a little later. I'll give you the specs on that. But when we're looking at a potential acquisition, obviously we want to look at not only what's in the immediate surroundings. The yellow star there is SunTrust. So our comfort level in being in the center of everything, we're across from City Hall. We're close to BOA Plaza and 100 North Tampa are two of our main competitors. We're close to them. We're close to two of the developments that are at least proposed for Tampa. Feldman's 52-story tower, and then you see the big blue piece. For those of you that are familiar with Tampa, that's Jeff Finnick and SPP's kind of Water Street redevelopment that they're working on the horizontal development for now. So the reason we had a comfort level here 2 years ago looking at this potential acquisition is one of the reasons was its central location here and its proximity to other downtown developments and downtown amenities. This is our kind of the components of our acquisition scorecard. I mean, we look at several different criteria when we're originally looking at an acquisition. We did this with SunTrust. All of these criteria have certain point levels. You score them, on a simple point level, you add up all the points, and it tells you whether it's something we really ought to pursue or not. Synergy with our existing portfolio. I mean, really what that means to us, do we have a building next door? Are we going to be able to take advantage of economies of scale? Is this going to give our customers more flexibility? In other words, if it's next door to an existing building, we can probably service it better than anybody else can because we already have a staff in immediate proximity. It gives our customers additional flexibility. So I mentioned before the 100% fungible part of our portfolio. got a customer in one building, we're gonna buy a new building, it's got available space. You know, that customer, any of the customers who are looking to grow can easily transition to another Highwoods building there. Submarket strength. I mean, the CBD in Tampa was starting to really, in 2015, was starting to grow. We were getting rent growth there. It was starting to become a stronger submarket. So we rank the submarkets. What submarket is that building in? What are the fundamentals in that submarket? Are rents growing? What's the occupancy level? Is it a landlord's market or is it a tenant's market? So submarket strength is a big key. These are all kind of under location. And then walk score. How many of you all know or are familiar with the walk score or what that is? Okay, good, good. It's not exact. I mean, I've plugged in some of our more suburban properties that are not particularly walkable and they've had a high walk score, and I've plugged in some of our urban ones and they haven't had as high a walk score. So it's not exact. It doesn't take everything into consideration, but it is something we look at. Yeah.
As a finer point, what resource do you use to obtain your walk score? Like the Redfin one on CoStar?
Yeah, I can't remember which one in particular, but yeah, there is kind of a dominant one that everybody uses. It's online that you just pump in the address and it gives you a walk score.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but
Okay.
that's become more and more of a consideration for us is you know, the downtowns have become, you know, urbanization is coming to not only the downtowns, but to some extent it's coming to the suburban markets as well, as people redevelop suburban properties to be more walkable, to have more amenities, things like that. So we do look at walk score on that from a location perspective. Physical property, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
I was gonna ask, for the leasing, do you lease other buildings as well in property management?
We can, and typically where that comes into play, you mean third party?
Yeah.
In other words, would we lease another owner's building?
Yeah, like the building down the street when you,
We do sometimes. I mean, we typically prefer to focus on our own owned portfolio and not be a third-party manager and not necessarily compete with the JLLs, the CBREs, the Cushman and Wakefields. Where it most comes into play is typically if we've had an asset that we have sold to an investor that we know very well. We've been managing it for years because we owned it, and that passive investor says, look, you guys know it the best, you know, will you please manage and lease it for us? And in that case, it really is not vastly different for us because we used to own the asset anyway. It's changed hands, but we still manage and lease it. And we do that for some of our larger customers as well. So, physical property, the competitiveness of the actual asset itself. So if you're happy with the submarket, you know, say you pick something in West Shore, it's a great submarket, you know, the fundamentals are strong. Now look at the building. How is that asset within the submarket? Is that considered, you know, one of the top 5? Is that a trophy asset in the submarket? In the case of SunTrust Financial Center, it was one of the top, considered one of the top 3 buildings in the submarket on everybody's Class A wish list. So you need to look at how competitive that building is with the other building stock in that submarket. Quality, Class A, B, and C, you know, we're really focused on Class A assets, best in class, and the BBDs. So, you know, you rank it based on A, B, or C. Age, that's a little more difficult. You know, historically, building stock gets built in tranches in a market. It's just kind of the way it works. So at least in West Shore and downtown Tampa, you know, you're looking at 20 and 30-year-old buildings. So assuming it was developed and constructed well originally, age is not necessarily as big a concern for us as the one below it, which is deferred maintenance. SunTrust was very well maintained. I mean, when we bought the building, we found very little deferred maintenance, very little that we could do to kind of put our stamp on it. I'll go over some of those things that we did do, but you know, that's compared to if you were to buy a building from maybe a distressed owner who had kind of, not kept up the HVAC, not kept up the plumbing, and there was a lot of deferred maintenance, obviously you have to factor that into your analysis. How much you're gonna have to spend just to get the building stable, not necessarily to improve the building. So deferred maintenance comes into that consideration as well. And then finally, financial considerations. Obviously, we look at the rent roll. What's our average imputed rent in the building compared to where the market is now? Are we below market? Are we above market? Are we right about where we need to be? Is there any value? Are we buying a building where we can basically push rates and increase our NOI above what we're purchasing it for? So rent roll compared to market, lease expirations, rollover risk. This is a big one for us. We'll look at the rent roll and we'll evaluate how many customers are expiring in each year. One of the things we look at is, okay, first 5 years, what % of the building rolls? What % of the building expires in 5 years? If we're looking at a rent roll and they've got it 100% leased, yet 75% of the building expires in 5 years, that means we've got a lot of work to do in the next 5 years to make sure it stays predominantly leased. As opposed to if we find a building where for the first 3 years, we've got 10% roll, and then, for the next first 10 years, we don't have more than 50% roll. That's more manageable. Got that? Understand the whole concept there? Tenant credit. Obviously, different businesses have different credit levels, but we're going to look at the largest customers in the building and make sure there are none of those who are a potential credit risk, which would devalue the building, or otherwise we'd have to be backfilling their space after they kicked out. So that affects our analysis and our sale price as well. And then finally, our projected sale price. In other words, we usually have a good idea by this time what we'd have to pay for it, either through the marketing team that's put the building on the market for sale. Sometimes they'll have kind of what they call a whisper price. Here's where we think it's going to trade. You need to be close to this. But we usually have a pretty good idea what it's worth. And then we compare that to replacement cost. So if we can purchase a Class A building with a good rent roll, with strong maintenance, and we can buy it below replacement cost, we can buy it below what we would have to take the development risk and take the lease-up risk for, then we're ahead of the game there as well. So, yeah.
I was looking through my notes from last time you came, and you had mentioned that there was a broker with undisclosed requirements in Tampa, and you were thinking it might be WeWork. Do you remember that specific listing?
Well, this one they're recording, so last time I was here they weren't recording that. So. I've heard they're out in the market, and I'll go into a little bit of the co-working. I've heard they're out in the market. We do have a co-working customer in our SunTrust building. I'll talk about that a little bit. And I do want to that's one of the kind of changes in our industry, one of the potential disruptors in the office building industry that I want to talk to you all a little bit about and get your input on as well. But yeah, they are out in the market. I don't know if that's the one I was specifically referring to at the time, but yeah, I know they're looking at the Tampa market.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure you touched on that or
Yeah.
you talked about that.
Yeah, will do. Thank you. Yeah.
If you're looking at a building that has a credit tenant that takes up a large portion of the space in the building, is that more of a risk in that if they leave, that's a big piece of your rollover? Or are you glad that you have a big credit tenant that takes up
We're glad we have a big tenant with good credit. I mean, that helps because in our mind, we're not expecting them to leave. We're expecting to be able to renew them. I mean, that's our focus from day one, is to make sure we take care of the customer enough so when their lease expiration comes up, assuming they need to stay in that market, they may need to grow, we want their first thought to be, we really don't want to move. We'd really rather stay in this building with Highwood. So all things being equal, yeah, we rather would have the big credit with the good, or the big tenant with the good credit. Much better than having a big tenant with not so good credit. So yeah, even though you're right, yeah, there's the potential that customer could leave. We've had that happen before, and we've had to backfill it. and maybe the backfill customers haven't had as good credit as the original high credit tenant. Yeah, that's a good point. So this is kind of the acquisition scorecard. These are the criteria we use when we look at an acquisition. Yeah.
Have you ever bought a building and repositioned it, or you just buy the building and with current status?
That is a really good question. It would depend on the asset. We have bought buildings and repositioned them. We've really got to be able to see the diamond in the rough. We've got to know there's a pony in the pile somewhere. We probably wouldn't buy a building that's on its last leg and try to reposition that. More likely, we have repositioned our existing assets. It's somewhat the same, but we've repositioned assets that we've owned. The building that our Tampa division is in, we're in a 7-building, really suburban office park that was developed over the 70s and 80s. It's called Tampa Bay Park. It sits kind of across from the Bucks Training Center and near Raymond James Stadium. And it was originally a campus for AT&T and IBM back when they had huge mainframes, and very few people, but a lot of office space required, a lot of power required. We have owned that for several years, and about probably 8 years ago, one of our largest customers left one of the buildings and left a fairly large space there. Had nothing to do with Highwoods. They just couldn't live through a restack. They were changing their business profile, and they were big enough where there was no way to displace their employees while we were rebuilding the interior of their space. So in their mind, and they're probably right, it was easier to go to a build-to-suit building to go to another building kind of fresh and new when their lease expired. Having said that, that left us with a significant amount of space we had to backfill in what was basically a 1980s or 1990s building. Traditional suburban building, very few amenities, very automobile oriented, large surface and structured parking lots. So we spent about $8 million reinventing or reestablishing that particular park, redoing the plaza areas, making it more pedestrian friendly, putting in collaborative spaces, putting in a fitness center. We took the company's original cafeteria that was only for their use, and we made it into a cafe. It's about 8,000 square feet for the entire office park there. All those amenities that we did, that repositioning we did, allowed us to backfill that space fairly quickly. And so that was a successful repositioning for us. I can't remember a time where we've actually bought a building that was largely empty and repositioned it. We did that in Tampa once, I'll go into that, but that was really, we bought that really more for the land and not for the empty building. Yeah.
In your new spec office buildings, what kind of amenities do you have?
It depends on the size of the building, and it depends on the location. I'll talk a little bit about that with our Independence Park development, but that's one of the trends we've seen, particularly with suburban buildings, is that amenities are starting to become more and more important. And basically maybe roughly in order of importance, it's number one, food service. Everybody likes to eat. Companies don't want their employees getting in their cars, driving wherever to try to get food. They'd much rather have food within walking distance. Fitness centers, collaborative lounges, things like that are important to try to, again, they're trying to keep their employee base close to the office and not have them, away from the office for an extended period. I'll talk about a few of those amenities that we've got coming up. Yep.
You mentioned that you delivered build-to-suit assets before. With construction costs rising, especially in Florida, are you pursuing those types of deals more heavily than ground-up speculative buildings?
We are, yeah. And we are simply because obviously our objective is funds from operations, NOI, long-term growth of our net operating income across our portfolio. The easiest way to do that is for buildings like Bridgestone, which are 100% occupied from day one. So yeah, we're heavily pursuing these single-user build-to-suit situations where it may not be quite as sensitive. The construction cost may not be quite as sensitive for a single-user building where they need the building, they need that amount of square footage, where if you built a spec building or an anchored spec building, there's still other opportunities in the market for people to compete with you, and that kind of even in a landlord's market, still keeps a lid on the rental rates there. So it's harder to make a spec development work than a 100% lease build to suit. This is just kind of some of the stats from our SunTrust acquisition. Again, I said this is about 2 years ago, but when we track about every quarter or so, we have what's called a development report card. And what we look at is we look how we originally underwrote the acquisition, what the occupancy was going to be, what our NOI was going to be, all that criteria, what capital we're going to spend on it. And every quarter we look at, okay, where are we compared to that? And I can't go into real specifics on that, but basically as of the end of last year, we're significantly ahead of where we had projected ourselves to be, both in terms of NOI and occupancy. I mean, we bought this building at the right time when CBD Tampa was improving, and we're very pleased with the asset. The $124 million, that is an investment number. That's the number that includes not only what our purchase price was, but what our intended immediate term investment is going to be in the building. One of the things we did, as I mentioned, it was a very well-maintained building. The previous owner had kept it up well, kept it as a trophy office building. But we do what we call highwoodizing. We put our own stamp on it. We spend the capital dollars necessary to make sure everybody understands it's a Highwoods building. This is kind of a unique thing we did there. We call it the Verve. We branded it as, it's basically our collaborative lounge. It's basically a lounge outside of everybody's office space that the customers in the building can use to go either have small team meetings, go relax, play ping pong, whatever. Kind of the unique thing, I don't know if you see it, the two middle pictures, this was one of the first facilities in a Class A office building downtown that had an outdoor deck. So if you see that bottom picture, top pictures at night, bottom pictures during the daytime, we have an outdoor deck on the 11th floor adjacent to the Verve, adjacent to our collaborative lounge, where people can go relax and be outside. And it's a nice, it's set for maybe in the dead of summer. It's really a nice venue out there. It's great for people to relax and kind of sit there and think a little bit. The other thing we did is we branded what we call a Spark. Again, another amenities. It's all about the amenities now. And this is basically our in-house conference center, training center. We have everything from small huddle rooms that you see in the top middle there. We have a traditional kind of conference room, boardroom. And then at the bottom left, you'll see, we've got a divisible training room that can seat up to about 70 people there in a classroom type setting. Great amenity for our customers. It allows them to not build all this big training space within their own space and allows more flexibility for them. So, and then the last thing was what we branded our fitness centers. And we don't have a fitness center in every building. Again, this is a 500,000 square foot CBD building, so it merits it. And so we redid the fitness center there, gets a lot of use by our customers, and it's a great amenity. So, Verve, which is our collaborative lounge, Spark, which is our conference center, our training facility, and then Velocity, which is our fitness center. Those are the three primary, besides food service, the three primary desired amenities that people will ask for in an office building. On the development side, I showed you a little bit about Highwood's development pipeline in some of the other markets. We are actively working on development opportunities in the Tampa market. The last development we delivered was 100% build-to-suit for Laser Spine Institute in West Shore, close to the airport. I don't know if you ever fly in or out of there, you'll see it. But again, we delivered that close to 2 years ago. So it's a combination headquarters building and ambulatory surgery center for them. Very well located to the airport, meets the needs of their customer base. It's in a development called Avion Park that has 3 or 4 hotels in it. So again, that helps their patients and their patients' families be right on site there. Independence Park. To answer your question, this was one of the developments that we bought to kind of reposition, and I'll show you the site plan in a minute, but just a general, very basic map of Tampa there. Independence Park, very central location in Tampa in the West Shore submarket, close to the airport, close to available labor, close to arterials, very well positioned. Here's our conceptual site plan. You see that kind of the building in the middle that looks like it's there? Well, it's there. And that's basically how we got the site. It was an old building for Johnson & Johnson. It was completely empty. And we basically bought the property for the acreage to redevelop it as suburban office in the West Shore market. The proximity of that building, though, with all the surface parking around it, made site planning a little more difficult because we couldn't displace all the parking for that building. We had to make sure we had additional setbacks between the buildings. So that is our conceptual plan. The good thing with this plan is we got 44 acres. It's very flexible. Buildings can go in different locations. They can be different sizes. We have the capacity to do more buildings if we want to displace some of the surface parking. We'll talk in a little bit about the whole ride-sharing autonomous vehicles. We've got a mixture of surface and structured parking here. Over time, if there's a decreased need for parking, we have office entitlements up to 700,000 square feet. We can potentially build additional office pads where some of that surface parking is if it's not needed in the future. We don't know yet. I mean, I want to get some input from you all because we're kind of in that middle area where it hasn't been completely adopted yet, and so we haven't seen an impact yet on development patterns. Talking about the amenities, where this is located, it's got great amenities in immediate proximity, but you're not going to walk to the local deli. We've got a deli on site. Across the street, there's another deli, so there's some food service there, but this is not an urban environment. It's really more of a suburban environment. So one of the things we have to look at is if our customers have to get in their cars, within a 3-mile radius, what can they get to? Well, they're so well located next to the airport and within West Shore. So granted, they have to get in their cars, but there's a ton of options for them, which basically is our amenity base there. Again, kind of more of a traditional suburban office park, but with a changing demographic in West Shore, there's some additional amenities available for them. Here's the concept for what's likely to be the first building there. Fairly straightforward, precast and glass, 30,000 square foot floor plates, 150,000 square feet. We're looking at, we're pre-leasing that now to a variety of prospects and customers. And as I said, 100% speculative is that's kind of a tough argument to make in today's investment committee. If we could get 1 or 2 floors pre-leased ahead of time, that would make things a lot easier. It'd make the pro forma look a bit better, and it would get us started quicker. Just your basic floor plate. I mean, we've done this floor plate over and over again. It works well for us. The base spacing works well. If you'll note, very few columns in the middle of the space, and we try to minimize the columns as much as possible. Highwoods Base Center Whereas you can see the airport there, and to the left of the airport is where Independence Park was. Highwoods Bay Center is down right there on the water as you come across from Pinellas County. Little different type of situation, a little bit more of a niche development there. You'll see Highwoods Bay Center 1. That's a 7-story, 200,000 square foot building that we started back in '06, and we did start that 100% spec. This is an old Koger Center here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. You know, Koger was one of the original suburban low-rise developers, and over time, these buildings either got bought and redeveloped or scraped entirely. So we've got one building there, 200,000 square feet. It's 100% leased. Normally, that would, you know, justify kicking off a second building. We are looking for pre-leasing on that second building. The challenge here is, you know, this building was designed last century, you know, basically precast and glass, pretty straightforward suburban office look. The architecture has changed over time. So our challenge here in terms of development is developing a building that's, you know, attractive to the new workforce, meets new architectural guidelines, but won't conflict with its sister building there. So the top building is your, you know, your basic precast and glass, more traditional suburban office building, and the bottom is the available site. And this is a concept of what that would look like. If you look to the left, you'll see that's really an accurate look of what Bay Center 1 looks like. So you'll see the challenge in kind of mirroring those two. They've got to be compatible, but at the same time, we're probably not going to develop a sister building that looks just like the first one. So they've got to kind of go together while still, you know, being a little bit modern. The reason I put these in here, these are some concepts of what the lobby areas would look like in Bay Center 2. One of the things we're seeing, one of the trends we're seeing in office development is kind of the blending of hospitality and office, the marriage between kind of what you'd see in a hotel lobby and what you're seeing in an office lobby, places for people to congregate, sit, make a phone call, meet, whatever. So a little bit more hospitality-esque is what you're seeing in some of the office building lobby developments.
That stuff becomes CAM, those areas then become CAM, I mean, they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, it's common area. So we have to be real careful. Dr. Ling asked a good question. Is that CAM, is that common area? It is common area. So, you know, we have what's called a you know, rentable to usable ratio. A customer leases 1,000 square feet, well, they pay rent on 1,150 square feet because, you know, they have to pay rent on part of the lobby, part of the, you know, all the common areas in the bathroom, things that they don't necessarily control. You know, the way the building's measured, you have to lease all the rentable square footage. So if you go crazy with the lobbies, if you go crazy with the common areas, it drives your rentable to usable factor up and it makes you not competitive. So it's a balancing act. Yeah. Development challenges. We're talking a little bit before, you know, office development, at least as long as I've been involved in it for the past 30 years, has been fairly straightforward. You know, you have customers, they come in, they know approximately how much square footage they need, they know approximately how much parking they need, you know, they're fairly stable for the next 5 or so years. We come to terms on a lease and we move forward. The advent of new technology, whether it's ride sharing, autonomous vehicles, you know, work from home, densification, there are a lot of things going on that potentially affect office development over the next decade or so. And some of the things I want to get your input on. One of the biggest challenges we're running into, and sorry for the graph, it's not necessarily the best graph, but what I tried to do is I tried to graph average rental rates, which is the top bar, the light blue bar, over the past 10 years or so. I think it's 06 to 17. Average rental rates, construction costs, and then is a rough proxy for inflation. I've got the Treasury in there as well. So one of the issues we're having right now, at least in Florida and I think in other markets, construction costs have just absolutely gone through the roof. If you look over that time period, that slope on the rental rate, equates to about, since 06 in the last 10 or 12 years, rental rates have gone up maybe 25% or so. On the flip side, construction costs have gone up 60 or 70%. I mean, developments that we were doing for $200 a square foot back in 2006 are now well over $300 a square foot. So if you're trying to get similar returns, you have the same level of leasing and development risk, all of a sudden the numbers simply aren't penciling out. And the sad thing is we knew this was coming. I mean, in 07 and 08, when we had the Great Recession, all the skilled construction labor, construction firms went down, all the skilled construction labor basically left Florida. And they just haven't come back. The skilled labor hasn't come back in enough of a manner to basically keep the labor costs in construction down. You combine that with the fact that materials really haven't gone down much at all, and some of them have gone up drastically, and you look at multifamily and the demand for construction services and other product types, and all of a sudden, office is having a hard time penciling out. So this is a little bit of a tough graph for us, trying to make that gap between rental rates that have gone up, but probably not gone up enough, and construction costs that have gone up way too much. Yeah.
With that spread diminishing over the years, is there a potential that you guys shift your strategy from Class A trophy assets to maybe Class B or C office, where you could build more for,
So like developing value office?
So it's like quantity over quality.
Yeah, what we're trying not to do, I mean, one of the things is as we move into new development, we'd probably rather not develop than develop something we're not particularly proud of. We're not going to develop anything that we probably wouldn't buy existing, if that's a good way to look at it. So if my job is to grow our portfolio by either acquiring or developing assets that increase the overall quality level of our portfolio, I'm probably not going to develop a value office. The second component of that, if you develop a value office or develop commodity office, you are certainly at the mercy of the market then. And basically the market's going to dictate what you're going to be able to lease that product for. There is no differentiation on that product. So we're probably not going to do that. We're probably going to try to figure out ways to either get the rental rates we need to on that, if it's 100% build-to-suit for a single customer, or try to work harder to get construction costs under control. We have a very talented development and construction team up in Raleigh that really, from a shell perspective, drives all that. And they're very good at what they do. They know the numbers well. So, they're struggling as well with the increased construction costs. But I guess the good side of that is, we have such a good team. This is not unique to us. Our competitors are dealing with this as well. It's not that construction costs are just high for Highwoods, they're high for everybody.
You said it's largely skilled labor that's driving that? Maybe not.
A lot of, if you start to separate it, you'll see it's the labor component that's really starting to kill us. And what we're finding out, and it's particularly in the shell development, but what you'll see, there'll be a certain number of qualified subcontractors in a given market, and they've got all the work they need right now. So when a general contractor goes to a sub and goes, okay, I got this other potential job, give me an estimate on it, the sub thinks to himself, God, I got more work than I know what to do with. Let's put a stupid number on this, and if it sticks, I'll slow play another job and do this,
So but at some point, I guess the question is if skilled labor is getting expensive, at some point wages are gonna be high enough relative to other parts of the country that labor
That
should
people
start-
will come back. They're just not coming back
Yeah,
fast
so it's
enough.
not- So skilled labor costs have risen, but the wages are quite to the point where people are leaving other states.
Yeah, there's a lag in that. You know, is it occurring now? Probably, but it hasn't yet factored into the overall construction market. Yeah.
Going back to the amenities like the Verve and Spark and the fitness center, how do you quantify the net benefit that building spaces like that will bring your?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Whenever we're looking at that capital investment, and it is a substantial capital investment, we look at it two ways. We look at it, can we get a higher rent? You know, is this going to justify a higher rent for our product? And sometimes it does, but the hard part is trying to quantify that before we've made the investment. It's really hard to say, okay, we're going to put a Verve, a Spark, and a Velocity in our next building, and because of that, we think we can get $1 a square foot more than the overall market. That's a tough argument to make with a straight face, because we just don't know. The argument we can make with a straight face is that this could accelerate our leasing. In other words, if a customer's looking at two different buildings and it's generally a jump ball, they're going to go with the building with more amenities. And so the premise there is that we will accelerate our leasing, have less downtime on the available space. So that's an argument we can make. The additional rent argument, that's usually we see that after the fact. Yeah. Some of the other development challenges is rental rates have gone up, and as companies have looked for ways to increase the bottom line, they've taken their existing space and they tried to cram more people in it. Well, you know, that works great for them, maybe for their employees. You know, they've gotten rid of private offices, they're going to benching, you know, hot seats, things like that, which basically allow their employees to come in and find a space to work. And some of their employees enjoy working like that. What it causes issues, particularly for the existing building stock, plumbing. You know, your plumbing of 20-year-old buildings, you know, was designed for 3 to 4 people per 1,000 square feet. Wasn't designed for 5 to 6 people per 1,000 square feet. So, you know, what you end up with are crowded bathrooms. Parking's the biggest issue. Again, these buildings, the older buildings, were designed for, you know, 3 to 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. As companies continue to densify, you know, they're looking for 5 or 6 parking spaces. It doesn't exist. There's no physical way to do that. So oftentimes we run into parking considerations. We've been able to manage that effectively by restricting both occupancy and parking in the lease. You know, we put the onus back on the company. That's fine. You know, if you want to try to cram 6 people per 1,000 in here, you need to understand it's going to affect the building systems. But more importantly, we're not going to give you a parking space for each one of your employees because we simply don't have it. So, here's where we start to talk about kind of potential. Yeah.
Real quick, regarding parking, you also talked about like the sharing economy. Have you ever given like Uber credits as a concession for parking? I've heard of old buildings doing that.
You know, we've thought about that. I think that's one of the things that landlords are going to look at going forward. Particularly, you know, we're going to talk about ride sharing in a little bit and how that can potentially affect development patterns over time. But you know, we've talked about that. We haven't instituted it yet. It is certainly an idea. However, you know, again, when we're talking about densification and we're talking about leasing a certain amount of space to a customer and they say, fine, this will work for us, and then, you know, they decide midway through their lease to densify their space, you know, in our mind, that's their responsibility at that point, if you follow me.
Yeah.
You know, we have a binding lease that says you have 4 spaces per 1,000. Your occupancy limit is 4 people per 1,000. Midway through that lease, they decide to in order to help their bottom line, they're going to put more people in the space. From our perspective, that is their responsibility. So we would look for the customer to basically give their employees, credits towards Uber. It wouldn't be necessarily our responsibility at that point. Now, if there's a renewal situation or there's a new lease, that may come up at that point. Yeah, that's a good idea, though. I mean, I think we're getting to that, and we'll talk a little bit about ride sharing. But I've heard some people say, ride sharing, you can start to compare that. I mean, everybody uses Uber or Lyft, I guess. You can start to compare that to where the cell phone industry was several years ago in terms of, one, underestimating use. I mean, I remember all kind of studies where people underestimated the cell phone use, and now it's basically ubiquitous. And then number two, if you remember the cell phone plans, we used to have fairly stringent cell phone plans. You had a certain number of minutes. If you went over that, you got slammed. You had a certain amount of data. If you went over that, you got slammed. Well, now I think most everybody's to a point where, it's unlimited data, unlimited minutes, things like that. But during that kind of ramp up of the cell phone industry, I've heard people say your transportation, your ride hailing options are going to be very similar to that. In a few years, you'll buy a ride sharing or a ride hailing plan where every month you pay a fixed fee and you get to either use a certain number of miles or unlimited miles or whatever. So I think that may be where you start to see that go. It's hard to read this graph, but a lot of this data came out of a study that was done last year by ULI and Green Street Advisors. And Dave Bragg will be at the Trends Conference next week, and he is one of the authors of this study that a lot of this data comes from. And it is extremely compelling in terms of the impact it could have on additional real estate investment, development, things like that. So I'd encourage you all, if you could, to get a hold of that, and if you're at the Trends Conference, to listen to his his presentation. This is a graph that shows over time, different age segments, how wanting to run out and get a driver's license has dropped over time. I remember when I turned 15, the first thing I wanted to do is get my learner's permit. Not so much anymore. My son wanted to do it, but I've talked to other parents where their kids are like, yeah, I don't want to drive. I don't care about driving. So that kind of obtaining a driver's license has dropped over time. One of the other challenges we're dealing with, co-working. And this all there's always been kind of an office suites concept out there where a company like Regis or Office Suites Plus, will lease space from a landlord. They'll lease 10,000 square feet. They'll make a bunch of offices. They'll staff it with, support. They'll answer your phone, things like that. Typically for, a 1 or 2 guy office or 1 or 2 woman office where, they just need somebody to answer the phone while they're out making sales calls or out working. The co-working is kind of a jump ahead on that. Co-working situation, it runs the gamut from, people that hang out at Panera and that's where they do their work and they, do their business on their cell phone at Panera, all the way up to the WeWorks, the Industrious, established co-working firms like that lease large amounts of space from existing office landlords for a long term, and this is going to be the interesting part, and then they have members or short-term leases or whatever where maybe it's month to month where their customers either have an office or have a space to do their business. And obviously it's a much higher margin because they have to pay for staff, things like that. The interesting thing is going to be, we're closely watching this trend. One, what impact is it going to have on traditional office space? Is it going to heavily compete? Is it going to act as an incubator and provide growing companies for the existing landlord? So how's that going to affect it? And to your point, you've got these WeWorks and Industrious and these established co-working firms on very long-term landlord leases We haven't seen what happens if their short-term leases start to drop off and their membership drops off. Then how do they pay the landlord their long-term rent? So it's going to be pretty interesting. Highwoods has a customer called Industrious, which is one of the established co-working firms. And we made a decision to lease to them for a long-term basis, primarily, because one, they're a good customer for us, and two, we believe that over time, we will see more benefit from their customers growing within their space and then moving on to our building than we will, them taking smaller customers from us. Our average size customer is 12,000 square feet, which is well above what a firm would look at if they were going to take industrial space or WeWork space. So, and these are some of the pictures from, this is actually their Dallas office, but it doesn't look much different than what we have at SunTrust. That's some of their SunTrust common area space. Yeah.
How do you evaluate their credit? Because even though on a corporate standpoint, they might have great credit and they will be able to pay you back in the case of default, but
Sure.
at the same time, you got that, headache of releasing the space
Right.
and stuff like that.
And that's something we had to look at very carefully, particularly given the fact that it's a 15-year term. If you look at some of this build-out's not inexpensive. So they had a fairly high requirement on their tenant improvement allowance. So the way we look at it is, one, we have to get comfortable with them as a going concern. We underwrite, a customer of this size, we underwrite the same way a bank would underwrite lending them money. I mean, we look at the same factors. We look at their business, we look at their burn rate, we look at their balance sheet, we look at everything before we make the capital investment to lease to them. Usually it's a situation where we will require some form of security deposit, and over and above, your traditional 1 month rent or something like that, it'd be an enhanced security deposit to make sure that we can at least recoup our capital investment on the TI and the leasing commissions. So that's typically how that's handled. Yeah.
Why the lease term so long? 15 years is a pretty long time for an office lease.
That is a great question. I think they have to do that to get the level of build out that they need to really attract their customers. That's number one. I think number two, they need to have some certainty of location and rent stream, what their rent obligation is going to be, even though it goes up annually over time. I think they're looking for that certainty to make sure that they can continue as a going concern. Because without the space, they've got nothing. They're basically resellers of office space in a different form. So that the space is one of the most important things to them. To get back to the parking, and these may be a little out of order. This was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal last month, and we are seeing some of this. This goes into the question of what's the technology behind ride sharing and autonomous vehicles going to do over time to the need for parking garages? And if so, if there's a decrease of 50% or a total elimination of the need for parking garages, what do you do with them? This is a particular example where they're looking at the potential for, these are kind of modules that they've used to try to insert into an existing parking garage for office or other uses. The trick there is how is this going to, how are the capital and investment markets going to look at this over time? If I believe, as I do, that the need for parking will decrease over time based on ride sharing, based on autonomous vehicles, if I believe that's the case, then how do we evaluate building parking garages that'll handle 5 per 1,000 in terms of density load? So I've got customers out there right now. In fact, we're looking at one who says, yeah, we want to look at a potential build-to-suit, we want to do a long-term lease, and we need parking for 6 per 1,000, okay? So what happens 10 years from now when they say they need 6 per thousand, but half their employee base is riding in autonomous vehicles or taking an Uber to work or whatever. If I were to walk into our investment committee or a bank or something and say, we're about ready to build an office building and we're not going to build any parking because we believe that in the next 5 to 10 years we're not going to need it. It's not going to fly at this point. So the interesting part is, how do you balance where you believe the market's going in terms of demand for parking with your immediate need for parking now? One of the ways to do it is people are looking long-term at, what do we do with the parking garages? Can we make them multifamily? Can we make them office? What can we do with that? The challenge there is the current structural design of a parking garage doesn't really lend itself to other uses. The slab to slab heights are not high enough for office. They're not completely level. You have ramps in the middle of the parking garage that are certainly not level. It's going to be an interesting dynamic. The only two entities I've heard so far that are redesigning their parking garage and paying the additional investment up front, which is probably, I don't know, anywhere from 20 to 30% to make the floor-to-floor heights taller in a garage, make them flat, put speed ramps on the outside. All of that's additional cost. The only entities I've heard doing that have been Disney and SPP in Tampa. Jeff Finnick and Water Street is considering doing that. We're having such a tough time making the construction numbers work right now. That's probably not an additional present value investment we would want to make to try to recoup something maybe 10 to 15 years down the road. We're just not seeing the payback. You have other issues, say you have a bunch of parking garages out there, you don't necessarily have the development entitlements or zoning to turn that into office. I mean, if you can physically do it, that's great, and you've prepared for it, that's great, but you've still got regulatory issues you've got to deal with where you may not have the development rights to make that garage an office building. So it's just something to think about over time. Another kind of challenge as we continue to develop office product is going to be, how much parking and who's responsible for it? I mean, at what point does that stop being the developer's responsibility and in a CBD fashion maybe shifts to the municipality or shifts to the customer itself or shifts to the employee? I mean, there's some markets, some CBD markets where office buildings don't have any parking, and it's just the obligation of the employee to find out how to get there and find where to park. Again, autonomous vehicles, we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but this shows the different levels of autonomous vehicles, everything from your basic level of cruise control all the way up to completely autonomous where there are no controls whatsoever in the car and the car controls itself. By most accounts, people think we're kind of at the level 2 with the advanced cruise control, lane assist, things like that. Before we really get to kind of mass adoption of this, you've got to be all the way up to level 5, and it's got to prove to be safe and effective. 2030 is the date I keep hearing thrown around for, quote, mass adoption. I guess that's as good a guess as anything. It is coming very, very quickly. Most of the major automakers are seeing the writing on the wall. They're looking hard at autonomous vehicles. You've got Tesla, who supposedly already has all the technology necessary to do that. Clearly, there's some considerations, not the least of which is regulatory, before we get to that point. The top benefit's safety. I mean, my experience is the driving environment's just getting worse and worse. I don't know whether the driving skills are getting worse from people out on the road, or they're just not following the rules of the road. But from a safety perspective, Something like 94% of highway fatalities are driver error. So if you can wipe a large portion of that out, it'll increase our safety levels significantly. It'll improve traffic flow because autonomous vehicles can follow closer to each other. The challenge is clearly it's going to be regulatory. Legally, I don't know. We've got, Florida seems to be the personal injury, state of all others. We have all kind of personal injury firms who make their living on car accidents. If the car accidents drop down, the few car accidents that there are, an autonomous vehicle accident, who do you sue? There's no driver to sue. There's no insurance for the driver to sue. So they've got to work through that. So there's some regulatory issues. I think the biggest one up here that people are worried about that could kind of slow down mass adoption is the security part of it. If these are largely computer-based, they talk to each other, things like that, there are probably going to be concerns, either founded or unfounded, about whether the systems can be hacked into, and can you cause disruption either in that traffic flow, or worse, could a hacker potentially cause an accident that way? So you're going to have to look at the benefits and the challenges, but those will be overcome. And in my opinion, this is coming, like it or not. It's a definite technology disruptor, and it is going to have an impact on office. Here's kind of a Green Street looked at the potential different real estate investment types, everything from self-storage to malls, to try to figure out kind of whose ox was going to get gored, or what the impact of ride sharing and autonomous vehicles would be. I think one of the obvious ones is self-storage. If people don't buy their own cars, if they don't own 2 cars, maybe they only own 1 car, if any, obviously, they still may be in houses with garages. All of a sudden their garage becomes their self-storage. The need for self-storage could drop off over time. I think one of the interesting ones on the negative side is billboards. I'd love to have somebody drive me to work every day where I could read the paper and, not have to worry about driving. But if you're doing that, you're not going to be looking at the billboards. That's a huge market right now in cities and along the interstates that I think would be negatively impacted. CBD office, that's one of the positive ones. If you take the premise where, people prefer to work in a CBD because there's more opportunity, more amenities, their customers are closer, they can walk to their customers, they can walk to any regulatory courts or regulatory that they need to. If you take the premise where it's probably more effective to do business downtown, if you remove the congestion factor, you remove the difficulty in parking in a downtown environment that would be brought about by ride sharing and by autonomous vehicles, potentially the CBD office segment could improve over time. So this is Green Street's look at what would benefit and what could potentially be impacted. The middle one, transit-oriented, is kind of a jump ball at this point, but what's interesting is transit-oriented development for the past 10 years has kind of been the buzzword, where development will normally grow in terms of office, retail, and residential around a transit stop. Well, what's the mass adoption of autonomous vehicles going to do to transit? Is it going to make that transit-oriented development a little less desirable because, maybe you're not getting on the train to get to work. Maybe you're just getting in an autonomous vehicle, and it doesn't particularly matter that you live close to the train station. Don't know at this point. It's just kind of hard to tell. And that's kind of it for me. I do want to get your input before you ask other questions. I do want your input on the co-working side of it. I know a lot of you all have had previous work experience. I'd be curious to know what type of office environment you had, whether it was traditional where managers had offices, whether it was open space, whether it was hoteling where you sat at a different desk every day, or whether any of you actually have had experience working in a co-working space. Anybody? Yes.
Where I worked last summer, on the walls in the office were, either white paint or some, element on the wall, like some paint we would write on, like just like a whiteboard.
Yeah.
And they would have these things called the Vinci sessions, is what they call them, where they just herd together. People are working right next to these walls. There's just desks for the junior analysts. And they would just all huddle around, bring their chairs in this room, and just start writing out ideas on like business process and kind of how they wanted to streamline something, or just kind of like idea generation, idea flow. But they had that all over the office to where you're walking by, you constantly see it. So they said that was a huge thing for them.
And they feel
emphasized that to me as an intern.
they feel that's productive.
I did, yes.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that from our customers, from a construction perspective. That kind of write-on, wipe-off paint's really expensive. So you got to kind of limit the areas that you use it. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of our customers use that. I mean, one of the things we see as we do space planning for our customers is there's kind of less what we call me space. So less private offices and more we space, more collaborative areas where people to get together. So, they're the area where they do serious contemplative work may be smaller, but the area where they do teamwork is bigger. And for a lot of companies, they really haven't reduced their space. They've just reduced the private space, but they've made the public space bigger. So the net reduction is nothing, if anything. So, yeah.
I've had two experiences with co-working. One I talked briefly about last time you were here. I worked for Liquid Space, which is
Yeah.
a co-working space. And then also I interned in London where I was in the WeWork there. And I loved it. I thought it was a really cool concept. If you really needed to focus and get your work done, there were pods you could go in and just focus there, or you could sit at your desk and talk to your coworkers without having to go all the way around to talk to them.
Now, did you have a desk, or did you have to sit someplace different every day?
We had their area was 2 long tables that sat about 8 people on each, so 16, and we faced each other. And we had set seats there.
But that was your company's area within WeWorks. In other words, you weren't going to get some guy off the street coming in to sit. Okay, all right.
Every company had their area.
Okay.
But the cool thing was we all went to the same water cooler. We all played with the same putting green, ping pong table.
Good.
Yeah, while we're
Well, we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, in our Verve at SunTrust, we got a ping pong table. Every time I'm in there, somebody's playing. So
yeah, we played a lot of ping pong.
yeah. Yes.
I worked at a tech company, and they tried to model some of their office space off of those collaborative working spaces. And what I saw was some of them worked very well for the engineering department that I was in, where collaboration was key. But they did it too much. They did it in areas where people didn't really need to be talking.
Right.
And it's almost as if they just did it in mass, and some of them were just in their own little space and made invisible walls, and it might as well have been a cubicle environment. So it seems like they saw that, they over pursued it, and it was good in some cases, but in a large majority of it was just kind of wasteful. Collaborative space.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think what you're kind of seeing in the office dynamics now is maybe people feel that the collaborative areas, the pendulum on that has swung a little far, and there are complaints about people being able to concentrate, noise levels in the office, things like that. So I think that's kind of a good analogy for what we may be seeing right now. I think you'll probably see that swing a little bit back to equilibrium, where there's good collaborative space and then there's sufficient space for people to do contemplative work. Yeah.
In the interest of time, maybe just, there's one more thought or observation.
Sure. Anything on the ride sharing or the autonomous vehicles? I mean, I'm a car guy, so I don't really want to give up my car, but at the same time, I'd love to take one to work every day and not have to worry about driving. Yeah.
I know a lot from what I read about autonomous driving and mass adoption, it's really only gonna work if it's kind of a complete adoption and you like don't have a mix of human drivers.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to say that. Yeah. I was afraid you were going to say that. I mean, that's
Do you think that's a pretty big impediment to complete adoption, or do you think that's kind of a way for them to make more motivation for them to make it almost like a legal framework?
That's, I think Time had an article a while back about, you know, if this gets mass adoption, will humans even be allowed to drive on the road? Will people be allowed to drive or to own cars? That's a little bit of a concern, at least for my generation, you know, kind of the car generation. I don't really want to give up my car. I'd love to take an autonomous vehicle to work, but I don't necessarily want to be told that I can't drive a car on the road. However, you make a great point. You know, if you do have 5% of the population that's driving themselves, you know, are they going to cause 95% of the accidents? You know, to get to mass adoption, you know, are you going to have to make it mandatory? Or, you know, is there an option where certain roads are autonomous vehicle only, and, you know, the neighborhood roads, you can either autonomous or drive your own car? I don't know. That's way out of my skill set. What I'm trying to do is just track the trends, how quickly we'll see them, and what impact that's going to have on office development and office space.
I think we should wrap it up there. In the interest of time, you'll stay around and answer some
Sure.
more questions.
Yeah,
All right,
be
thank you.
pleased to. Thank you.